Hey everyone! In this video, we're going to talk about arrow functions. We'll look at what makes them different from regular functions, their unique features, and most importantly, where and how to use them in React. Basically, arrow functions are a shorter way to write function expressions. But it's not just about saving a few keystrokes. They behave a bit differently too, and we'll talk about that later. Alright, let's take a look at the syntax. As you can see, we're dropping the function keyword entirely. We still have the parentheses for our parameters, followed by the arrow symbol, which points to the function body. Now, let's go through some common ways of writing arrow functions. First, parameters. If you only have one parameter, you can actually skip the parentheses altogether. But if you have zero or multiple parameters, you have to keep them in. Let's look at the function body. If your function is just a one-liner that returns a value, you can skip the curly braces and also skip the return keyword. This is called an implicit return, so the value is returned automatically. If you want to split it across multiple lines for readability, which we do a lot in React, just use parentheses. Now, one thing to keep in mind. If you're trying to implicitly return an object, you must wrap it in parentheses. Otherwise, JavaScript thinks those curly braces are for a code block and your code will break. So it should look like this. In React, you're going to see arrow functions everywhere. We use them to define functional components, which is a modern standard, as callback function, like when mapping over an array, to define event handler functions, and also when passing functions as event handlers, for example, when we pass a function to an onClick prop. Here, just a quick note. We use an arrow functions here specifically when we want to pass an argument. For example, if I need to pass an ID to the event handler function, I'd write it like this. However, if you don't need to pass any arguments, you can keep it even simpler and just pass the function name itself. This is also the preferred approach in React. Now, let's look at the simple real-world example. Here, we use an arrow function to define the component. Inside, we use another one as a callback function to map through our data. Then we use another arrow function for the onClick event. And finally, we use here an arrow function to define an event handler function. This is exactly how we'll be using arrow functions every day in React applications. Before we wrap up, there is one important thing to keep in mind. Besides the shorter syntax, there are some technical differences under the hood, but since we are focused on React, you really only need to remember one thing. Arrow functions don't have their own this. Instead, they use this from the surrounding code. In the past, with old React class components, this was a huge deal and caused a lot of bugs. In modern React, you won't run into this as often, but it's the main reason why arrow functions are so predictable and why we use them almost everywhere today. Alright, to wrap things up, let's look at a simpler comparison. Here is a regular function expression, and here's the same function written as an arrow function. Notice how we use parentheses for multiple parameters and skip the curly braces here because of implicit return. As you can see, the arrow function version is shorter, cleaner, and easier to read. And that's really the main idea. Arrow functions give us a more concise way to write function expressions with a few small differences that make them especially useful in React. Thanks for watching, see you in the next one.